Hello everyone. Tonight we're starting with a topic that's a little less philosophical, but just as complex. Viking sex. It involved politics, power, and sometimes public display. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content. At a time when many people still had hay in their armpits, English monks actually complained about Viking hygiene. One chronicler accused Viking men of being too clean and unfairly appealing to local women. That's right, their charm was blamed on soap. And honestly, in a world that smelled like compost, the guy who bathed weekly and styled his hair stood out. Not exactly a pickup line, this was cultural charm. If your poem didn't include at least 3 nature references, you were doing it wrong. But not all of it was gentle. Some poems were very bold. And if a man wrote one about a woman without her permission, it could be dangerous or even illegal, because nothing says romance like discussing your future over meat and sheep prices. And the woman, technically, a free woman could refuse, but whether that was accepted depended on her family's needs, land, allies, or just wanting to settle things quickly. And let me know in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you. Suggesting a woman was sexually available without her agreement could lead to exile or worse. Let's not pretend Viking love was all roses and candlelight. It was more like, your father has 3 goats. I have strong arms. Let's make a deal. Consent existed, yes, but it had to navigate through dowries, family interests, and strategic alliances. So yes, in Viking society, writing an offensive poem could get you killed. Women didn't just stay silent either. They could respond with their own cutting verses. If a man's poem was weak or vulgar, she might publicly embarrass him with a clever response. One saga tells of a woman rejecting a man so sharply, he joined a monastery out of shame. She didn't just reject him, she sent him toward religion. It's always interesting to see how far this channel reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a bit of background noise. And let's begin tonight's journey. Let's clear something up. Vikings were much cleaner than most people think. Not spa-level clean, but by medieval standards, they were almost... While the rest of Europe often avoided bathing altogether, the Norse were washing themselves once a week, using soap made from animal fat and ash. It probably smelled earthy, but compared to their neighbors, they must have seemed like walking clouds of fragrance and confidence. They combed their hair, trimmed beards, filed nails, and carried grooming kits made from bone and metal. Picture arriving at a longhouse date with neat braids, a carved comb, and fresh breath. But this wasn't just vanity. In Viking culture, grooming showed status. A free man was expected to look the part. If you were messy, people might assume you were poor, enslaved, or just lazy, someone who couldn't even pick out lice for his partner. Cleanliness also had ritual value. You washed before feasts, before battle, and before intimacy. It wasn't just about dirt, it was about preparing yourself for the gods, ancestors, or your longhouse date. If you think Viking romance was all grunting and dragging someone off by their braid, think again. These weren't just raiders. They were also emotional, metaphor-loving individuals who expressed love through poetry, and sometimes light threats. Vikings had a poetic tradition called skaldic poetry, full of metaphors so complex it made Shakespeare look simple. And yes, it was used to flirt. A Viking might compare a woman's hair to golden flax, her walk to a swan, or if things were getting serious, her body to a finely crafted sword. There's a law in the Icelandic Gragas Code that banned men from composing rude, insulting, or explicit poems. So while Vikings carried swords, the real weapon in romance was poetry filled with metaphors, bragging, and legal risk, if overused. Here's how it usually worked. A man wanted to marry, but instead of singing under a window, he sent his father, uncle, or a trusted friend to negotiate with the girl's father. Because nothing says romance like discussing your future over meat and sheep prices. And the woman, technically, a free woman could refuse. But whether that was accepted depended on her family's needs, land, allies, or just wanting to settle things quickly. A woman who was forced into marriage had legal options. Kidnapping for marriage was banned, but sometimes praised in poetry, a confusing message. When legal texts and love songs don't agree, she could announce a divorce publicly 3 times in front of witnesses. These women, often enslaved, were expected to cook, keep company, and have sex. A woman's past wasn't a deal breaker, unless it involved someone else's husband or caused a major scandal. A woman who could manage land, handle trade, and represent herself in legal matters was far more valuable than one with an untouched personal life. Life was hard. Winters were long. Practicality usually won. Being in a relationship before marriage wasn't shameful. It was part of life. If a man publicly bragged about a past partner without her consent, he could face legal action. Essentially, kiss and tell wasn't just rude, could be illegal. Take Frey, the god of fertility. He wasn't subtle. He's often shown with exaggerated features representing his role. His worship involved rituals that celebrated life, love, and very symbolic crops. The gods acted out, not because they were evil, but because life was complicated. And sometimes, your greatest lesson came from a shape-shifting horse parent. If you wanted a modest deity, Frey wasn't the one. Put simply, do what you want. Just don't look weak doing it. Consent in those cases was mostly ignored. On the other hand, if a husband was neglectful emotionally or physically, the wife could leave. If you were seen as weak or yielding, your reputation could collapse faster than a bad longship. For Viking men, the worst insult wasn't being called a thief or a coward. It was being called urgia, term so serious it could spark a duel. The society was male-dominated, absolutely, but women had rights that many medieval European women didn't. They could own property, file for divorce, and express preferences in relationships. Still, there were expectations. A woman who was too assertive might be seen as masculine, but in Viking culture, that wasn't always negative. Some female saga characters were praised for their sharp words and sword skills. Being labeled urgy meant you were passive, submissive, or failed to meet expectations. In one story, Loki transforms into a female horse to distract a magical stallion. It works so well that Loki becomes pregnant and later gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleip. This, somehow, is treated as a quirky tale rather than a cosmic HR complaint. A man who showed too much emotion or practiced Norse form of magic tied to intuition might be marked. Seer was seen as women's work. If a man did it, people assumed he was emotional, poetic, and maybe weaving something. Viking women didn't have to suffer in silence. They could speak up publicly, with legal support. No court, no forms, just a loud breakup. At a public gathering, some stories suggest strong women could reject suitors. Others imply they needed to escape if they tried. Still, the Vikings weren't totally harsh about it. His plan, grunt, and hope. No one notices the beard. Spoiler, but the hammer is recovered, and everyone leaves slightly confused. And while bride kidnapping might sound romantic in some old stories, Viking law did consider it illegal, though not always enforced, because the Vikings didn't see romance, gender, or intimacy as neat categories. Their myths were messy, fluid, and far from modern norms. Many Norse gods and heroes had relationships that today would require entire legal courses to unpack. The line between affection and absurdity was thin, and the gods crossed it often, usually on horseback. There were also concubines called bed thralls in Viking law. As for premarital relationships, the Vikings were surprisingly open-minded. While other medieval cultures focused on purity and chastity, the Norse were more relaxed. If 2 adults agreed to a relationship, that was their business. And the world kept turning. Virginity wasn't treated as a woman's main value. Women were respected for their abilities, family status, and yes, their reputation, but that reputation didn't rely entirely on their sexual history. In fact, some sagas even praise bold women who pursued with Thor, who they wanted, especially when they did so with confidence and a strong sword arm. The Vikings were practical people. Families might raise an eyebrow or both if the timing looked suspicious, but they didn't lock daughters in towers or start designing purity devices. This wasn't just cultural openness. It was practical survival. Viking society needed strong partnerships. That said, discretion was still important. While premarital relationships weren't punished, boasting about them could lead to problems. In short, Vikings respected personal freedom as long as it didn't create unnecessary drama at the feast. Think modern myths are strange. Wait until you explore the Norse pantheon, a divine mix of shape, cross-dressing, and chaotic love stories that made up a regular Tuesday. Then there's Loki, the ultimate myth. In another myth, Thor dresses as a bride to sneak into a wedding and recover his stolen hammer. His disguise, a wedding dress and veil. Why does any of this matter? Here's the interesting part. These stories weren't shocking. They were normal. Fertility, love, and trickery were divine forces. Viking society had rules, many of them. But when it came to gender and relationships, the rules were flexible. Let's explain. This wasn't about orientation, it was about dominance. Viking masculinity wasn't defined by who you were with, but by how you acted. Women, on the other hand, had a bit more flexibility. Strangely, the same behaviors in men could backfire. A man who showed too much emotion or practiced a Norse form of magic tied to intuition might. Seer was seen as women's work. If a man did it, people assumed he was emotional, poetic, and maybe weaving something. The irony. Odin, the chief Norse god, was skilled in seer, but when he did it, it was wise. When you did it, it was suspicious, a classic case of double standards. In Viking society, words could cut deep, sometimes fatally. Insults weren't just rude. They were legal weapons. Calling someone ogre or rega, both versions of unmanly, could be grounds for a legal fight, not just a shouting matcha fight to the death. Fully legal. It could destroy your standing, and it worked both ways. If you made the accusation and couldn't prove it, you could be exiled. So people chose their words carefully. But this reveals something deeper. Intimacy and public image were connected. A man's romantic reputation reflected his strength. If a married woman was caught cheating, her husband could divorce her, shame her publicly, or if his pride was seriously damaged, handle it with a sword. But if the woman had a husband, especially one with a temper, or a lot of brothers, that was a serious problem. In extreme cases, her lover might not live to regret it. If a wife caught her husband cheating, she could take legal action and end the marriage. Viking women had real choices. Some sagas describe wives calmly packing their things, announcing the divorce in front of witnesses, and leaving with the kids, the farm, and the goats. If people saw him as weak, sensitive, or out of control, he didn't just lose face. He lost status. That often meant catching them in the act or getting witnesses. Viking romance didn't always rely on charm, poetry, or a strong jawline. Women practiced it openly, often as respected valvas or shamans. Men, not so much. A man using seer risked being seen as unmanly, not because of the magic itself, but because it was seen as women's work, and Viking masculinity didn't take that well. Sometimes it leaned on magic, specifically a mysterious practice called seer, pronounced Sather, which was part sorcery, part spiritual therapy, and part my ex won't return my runes. Also, you're embarrassing us. Odin, being Odin, doesn't care. When you have one eye and a raven, public judgment doesn't hit as hard. Many believe that misusing magic could rebound like a badly made boomerang. Not everyone could write great love poetry, but anyone could try a charm and hope it worked. No one wanted their love spell turning into a village-wide emotional disaster. Everyone knew intimacy happened sometimes within earshot. Occasionally, while someone stirred stew, children were often conceived in those crowded homes, and people developed a group skill. Strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge it. You didn't comment. You definitely avoided eye contact. You just stared at the fire and thought about fish. As you might guess, this made for some uncomfortable family meals. Think. Drink this herbal tea and fall from you, or else your cattle might have a rough week. Vikings didn't do things halfway. Maybe you turned toward the fire, pulled up a fur, and tried to ignore Uncle Bjorn snoring 2 feet away. Romantic. Not quite. Practical. definitely. Not in a strange way, but in a we're all trying to survive the cold kind of way. Parents, children, grandparents, workers, and sometimes a goat, all under one roof. Walls were optional. Curtains were rare. Personal space wasn't part of the design. Vikings had firelight, livestock snoring, and 6 relatives pretending nothing was happening. And once that was gone, good luck getting a seat at the feast. If someone dishonored your household, responding with a broken door or a burnt barn wasn't unexpected. A rumor, a joke, or a careless comment could trigger chaos. If it cast doubt on someone's identity or honor, if someone questioned your honor, masculinity, or performance, you could challenge them to a duel. Who got embarrassed, who got hurt, and who got the livestock. That's what mattered most. No scarlet letters. If someone wasn't returning your feelings, the right spell might suddenly make you look like the most attractive person this side of Valhalla. Coincidence? Probably not. Just reputations, real estate, and maybe a few missing roof beams. That's right, say the wrong thing, and you might end up shirtless in the forest at sunrise, sword in hand. Because you implied Olaf was underwhelming in bed. At the center of this was on, a special category of public insult. This might sound extreme, but reputation was everything in close-knit communities. If someone accused you of being weak or submissive, it wasn't just personal. But when they didn't, someone usually ended up bleeding beside a few. Interestingly, these disputes weren't always about what actually happened in private. Often, they were about how things looked. In short, Vikings had no tolerance for careless insults. Marriage and love were fine until someone got caught with the neighbor's spouse. Then things got noisy, legal, and occasionally violent. Let's go over the basics. Adultery was taken seriously, but not the same way for everyone. Now, if a married man cheated, the reaction varied. Sleeping with an unmarried woman wasn't a huge scandal. Here's where it gets interesting. The Norse legal system didn't rely on rumors. If you accused someone of adultery, you had to prove it. And while the law didn't always support physical revenge, Viking culture did. Still, people cheated. They always do. In the end, Viking adultery laws were more about honor and property than morality. It came with lawsuits, jewelry, and the occasional goat-related custody dispute. Seer was used for many purposes: predicting the future, cursing enemies, influencing weather, and occasionally manipulating love or desire. But here's the catch. Seer was considered a feminine craft. There's even a saga where Odin, the king of the gods, is criticized for practicing seer. His enemies essentially say, "Nice spell." Very mystical. As for love magic, it ranged from harmless charms to more serious enchantments. Of course, there were risks. If you used magic to influence someone's feelings, especially without consent, it could backfire, both legally and supernaturally. Still, for those brave enough, and with a few herb seer provided options, today, romance might need mood lighting, candles, and playlists. Let's talk about privacy, or really, the total lack of it. Viking homes were longhouses, large shared buildings where families lived, worked, ate, and slept. So when it came to intimacy, there was no slipping off to a quiet room. This lack of privacy didn't stop anyone. Viking society was pretty relaxed about communal living. Everyone knew intimacy happened sometimes within earshot. Occasionally, while someone stirred stew, children were often conceived in those crowded homes, and people developed a group skill: strategic pretending. Wealthier families might hang tapestries or set up DVDs, the Viking version of a do not disturb sign. Viking society didn't obsess over modesty like later Christian cultures did. Physical closeness was normal, practical, and expected. People just preferred not to talk about it while grandma was nearby. But for most, a little timing and subtlety were the best tools available. You didn't acknowledge it. You didn't comment. You definitely avoided eye contact. You just stared at the fire and thought about fish. Herbs like juniper, mugwort, and wild carrot were known across Europe for their potential contraceptive effects. Did they work? Possibly. Did they taste awful? Probably. Men weren't expected to know much about those matters. The long answer is, yes, but only if you managed public perception carefully. A man might sail across a stormy sea, using only stars and a raven butt. Ask him how mugwort works, and he'd look confused. And while that might sound progressive for a warrior culture, it came with one big condition. If you really wanted privacy, there were a few options. Still, despite the conditions, there was no real shame, because clearly, nothing says I'm the dominant one. Like fighting at sunrise over a rumor about Now, let's talk about contraception, or, as the Vikings understood it, hope, herbs, and maybe magic. Divorce in Viking society wasn't a long legal struggle. All it took was a clear statement in front of witnesses. A woman could end a marriage by speaking publicly or at the front door, or by the bed saying she was leaving. It helped if she gave a reason, like abandonment, abuse, or even bad poetry in bed. It was more like, I'm done. I'm taking the ox. Goodbye. Property and children were usually divided by custom or previous agreements. Divorce didn't make them social outcasts. In fact, many remarried, especially if they were wealthy, skilled, or tough enough to handle a goat. It wasn't always smooth, but it was surprisingly straightforward. No 6-month wait, no drawn-out custody battles. It was a political alliance, a legal agreement, and a community gathering with lots of opinions and, usually, the smell of smoked fish. The party could last a week, depending on the family's wealth and sense of drama. Think Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more awkward speeches. Honestly, they received much less attention in legal texts, probably because their relationships weren't viewed as a threat to the social order. Two women together didn't produce heirs, didn't interfere with property rights, and didn't challenge male authority. Still, the culture generally accepted that people sometimes moved on. So, while there isn't much direct evidence, such relationships may have existed and were either quietly accepted or simply ignored. If two men were involved, the issue wasn't who they loved, it was about who held the dominant role. A man could wear furs, braid his beard, and even serenade his friend with emotional poetry and still be admired. But if anyone implied he wasn't dominant in private, his reputation could collapse faster than a leaky longship. The man seen as passive could be mocked, shamed, or even challenged over his masculinity. There's no Viking era manual titled How to Avoid Children While Raiding, but there are clues. It's likely they had some understanding of how to manage reproduction or at least delay it. Viking women were very knowledgeable about plants, not just for healing or treating fevers, but also for reducing the chances of pregnancy. There's also evidence that practices like extended breastfeeding were used strategically to space out children. Not exactly romantic, but effective. Loki, for example, had children as both male and female, and no one seemed bothered. The gods were flexible. It was the humans who needed everything to fit into neat saga-style stories. Think of it as the Viking version of family planning without the charts. Children were valued, of course, especially sons for fighting and daughters for marriage, but sex wasn't just about having heirs. Pleasure was part of the experience too. Interestingly, Viking society didn't fixate on reproduction like later religious cultures did. People fall in love, grow distant, or get bored and separate. That kind of realism suggests a society that wasn't obsessed with purity. Even in the sagas, romantic relationships are shown with surprising honesty. Of course, if contraception failed, the burden mostly fell on the woman. If you've ever wondered whether same-sex relationships existed in Viking society, the short answer is yes. Vikings didn't use modern terms for sexuality, but they clearly understood that people sometimes formed deep, even romantic bonds with others of the same gender. Viking masculinity was based on dominance, not just in battle, but in every part of life. This wasn't a moral issue, it was about status. Some sagas even mention men being accused of inappropriate behavior, and then challenging others to duels to defend their honor. And what about women? Interestingly, the Norse gods didn't seem to care much about gender. If you think Viking marriages were all grand feasts, exchanged swords, and blood oaths, you might be surprised by how easily they could end. Viking women could divorce their husbands without needing a lawyer, a judge, or a special ritual. That was enough. Once declared, the marriage was over. Many women kept their dowries and sometimes retained control of property they brought into the marriage. Of course, not all breakups were peaceful. Some lead to accusations, family disputes, or dramatic exits worthy of a saga. The gods were unpredictable. Why? Men could also divorce using the same method, though their reasons usually involve disobedience, which says a lot about male expectations. Think modern weddings are odd. The Vikings had goat sacrifices, bridal swords, and some very uncomfortable bedroom rituals. A Viking wedding was more than a celebration. It was a political alliance, a legal agreement, and a community gathering with lots of opinions and, usually, the smell of smoked fish. The party could last a week, depending on the family's wealth and sense of drama. The groom might bring out a family sword to show he was ready for marriage, because nothing says commitment like waving a weapon in front of your future-in-law. Think Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more awkward speeches. If the marriage wasn't confirmed, someone could later challenge its legitimacy. That could lead to loss or worse, feuds. So it was easier to just stand outside and hope for no eye contact. Sometimes, family members waited outside the bedroom door with torches to make sure the couple followed through and didn't just fall asleep. The bride and groom had symbolic roles. The bride's hair was unbraided to mark the end of maidenhood, and she might wear a necklace with mythological meaning. There were also rituals involving Thor's hammer, shared drinks, and oaths sworn in front of others, usually with a lot of mead. The sagas are full of love, jealousy, clever women, and emotionally distant men. Some stories end in weddings, others in heartbreak and violence. They were respected for their intelligence, feared for their words, and occasionally honored in verse, which, for Vikings, was the highest praise. Then came consummation. It wasn't just expected, it was required. In some regions, it even had to be witnessed. Yes, witnessed, because this was about validating a legal agreement. Marriage affected property, inheritance, and alliances. The divine world set the tone. Love was powerful, messy, and far from modest. Not every wedding was so intense. In quieter communities, consummation was assumed, or people just bragged the next morning. The term honeymoon comes from the tradition of drinking honey wine for a full moon cycle after the wedding to increase fertility. In reality, you might still be asked to help fix the church roof, cook for the village, or round up pigs that ran off during the celebrations. Still, it was better than digging turnips. It could bring honor or disgrace. It was surprisingly open and, in some ways, ahead of its time. Your lord might not demand rent on feast days, but he could expect your son to serve at his table, or your daughter to help dress the lady of the manor in a festival gown. Everyone wore their best or least muddy clothes, shared what little food they had, and pretended for a day that life wasn't all labor, taxes, and toothaches. But above all, it wasn't about being ideal, it was about surviving love with your pride, your home, and your sword arm still intact. And definitely don't skip mass to nap in the barn, unless you wanted a firm lecture from Father Bartholomew and a week of penance. It wasn't one day, but 12 days of stories by the fire, elf-fueled caroling, and maybe a roasted pig if someone was lucky. Assuming your idea of magic includes roasted animals, evergreens nailed to wooden beams, and a passed-out uncle in a haystack. Its ashes were believed to bring good luck, which made sense because keeping a tree burning indoors for 12 days was basically a managed fire hazard. For medieval peasants, yours wasn't just one day. It lasted 12 full, lively, and sometimes disorderly days from Christmas to Epiphany. During this time, daily rules relaxed, and even the poorest villagers could enjoy some celebration. Think of it as a medieval Netflix binge with food, romantic and sticky. If your local lord was generous, you might get extra meat ale and a shared pig roasting over a fire. If not, then dried beans, stew of unknown ingredients, and salted bread were considered a treat. Yomi Duand sang about it, loudly, off-key, and often while drunk. By now, you've likely realized Viking relationships weren't just about violence and loud behavior. Holy days were religious observances scattered throughout the year. They were complex, strategic, poetic, magical, and sometimes involved livestock. These weren't optional. You were expected to pause, work, attend mass, and reflect on your sins. Sex in Viking society wasn't shameful or hidden. It was part of life, like farming, raiding, or wondering if your neighbor held a grudge. It served sacred and practical roles, producing heirs, building alliances, resolving disputes, or simply surviving winter. Passion existed, but it was mixed with law, honor, and community expectations. Love wasn't a private matter. It involved your aunt, your livestock, and 3 relatives carrying swords. Romance was a shared experience. Viking women weren't just background characters. They seduced, divorced, made deals, cursed, and sometimes burned things down. Even the gods treated love as a challenge. Loki changed genders. Freyr celebrated his fertility. Odin used love spells without hesitation. So, what was sex like for Vikings? It was social. It was poetic. It had legal consequences. Because when Vikings loved, they did it like everything else, with intensity, boldness, and no regrets. If you were a medieval peasant, don't imagine holidays meant sitting by the fire with wine while others did the chores. On paper, it seemed like a break from hard labor. The church gave peasants many feast days: Easter, saints' days, Marian festivals, and even obscure local ones, honoring relics like St. Gertrude's. But peasants, ever practical, used these days for joy eating, singing, and drinking. Still, don't get too relaxed. Holy days often blurred the line between sacred rest and unpaid work, but they were deeply communal. These weren't personal days. Often they were shared events. Yes, peasants had holidays, surprisingly, many of them, but each came with conditions. Attend church, avoid working the fields, maybe help with the mystery play. Yule, the most magical time of the year. It started on Christmas Eve, when the Yule log, an actual tree, not a dessert, was dragged into the hearth and burned for the whole season. Feasting was central to Yule, although what counted as a feast varied greatly. If your local lord was generous, you might get extra meat, ale, and a shared pig roasting over a fire. If not, then dried beans, stew of unknown ingredients, and salted bread were considered a treat. You made Duan sang about it, loudly, off-key, and often while drunk. There were songs, games, and masks too, because nothing says the birth of Christ like dressing up as a bear and scaring your neighbors. Many of these traditions had roots in pre-Christian rituals, remnants of pagan solstice, festivals rebranded for Christianity. For example, evergreens represented eternal life and were hung indoors, not just for looks, but to ward off evil and peasant logic, rats. Social roles also flipped during Yule. Some villages picked a lord of misrule, usually the village fool, to mock the gentry and lead the festivities. For 12 days, the low could act like the high until January arrived and reality returned, like a roof collapsing under snow. Despite the silliness, Yule was sacred not only religiously, but emotionally. It brought warmth during the cold, light in the darkness, and laughter in a world where losing all your teeth by 30 was normal. During those 12 days, peasants weren't just surviving, they were celebrating. And on January 6th, it all ended. The pig bones were gone, the ale had turned sour, and your spouse was back to reminding you to fix the barn roof you'd ignored all week. If Yule was about ale and ashes, May Day was about flowers and fertility, not just in the fields. For medieval peasants, May 1st wasn't just a calendar date. It was a colorful, musical, and often mischievous event, celebrated with energy only possible. When winter was finally over and crops were still promising, celebrations began at dawn, as villagers went into the woods to gather greenery, blossoms, and sometimes start a bit of gossip. Young people especially enjoyed this, often disappearing in pairs and returning looking a bit disheveled. Elders might frown, but no one complained. A few extra babies in early February were part of the usual rhythm of life. The center of the festival was the maypole, a tall wooden pole placed on the village green and decorated with ribbons, flowers, and local symbols that were subtly suggestive. Peasants danced around it in circles, laughing, sweating, and ignoring the fact that it was basically a leftover pagan fertility symbol. The church didn't approve, of course, but not enough to stop it. Even Father Bartholomew sometimes tapped his foot. Asterisk music filled the air, drums, flutes, and if you were unlucky, bagpipes. There were plays, races, wrestling matches, and sometimes people jumping over bonfires to show bravery or earn a bit of luck. These acts were deeply symbolic, celebrating nature's return and hopes for a good harvest, but mostly they were just an excuse for fun. Peasants, who usually wore ragged tunics, dressed up in their finest, still worn, but with added garlands. A May Queen was crowned, symbolizing spring, youth, and beauty, which, in peasant terms, usually meant she had most of her teeth and no visible sores. Unlike church holidays, May Day wasn't controlled by scripture or bells. It was older than saints or sermons, celebration of the body as much as the spirit. And though the local lord might demand labor again the next morning, for one flower-covered day, even the lowest villagers could dance like they owned the meadow. Medieval calendars were packed with saints, each with a feast day. That might sound like endless parties, and technically, it was, but imagine celebrating a relative's birthday every few days, except she's a martyred nun who died of an infected wound. Welcome to the world of saints' days. Peasants loved them, not always for spiritual reasons, but because it meant a break from fieldwork and a chance to eat. These days usually began with mass, followed by long hours or even days of celebration. Think processions with relics, muddy performances of religious plays, and kegs tapped before noon. And always that one barefoot guy shouting about S3X Blaze's miracle with a fisa. Each village had its favorite saint. Some chose useful ones, like Saint Isidore, for farmers, or Saint Apollonia, for toothaches. Others honored obscure figures, like Saint Ethelbert of Nowhere, who allegedly cured both leprosy and hiccups. Regardless of the saint, the day included prayers, rituals, and often roasting a goat. If a village owned a relic piece of bone, fabric, or an item said to be St. Annis's actual eyeball, the day became a major festival. Pilgrims might visit, vendors set up stalls, locals performed religious plays, mixing inspiration with accidental comedy, like props falling or someone forgetting their lines. Best of all, you didn't have to do hard labor. Sure, you might help decorate, play an instrument poorly, or haul water for Stubat. It wasn't plowing, and you might get food and good gossip in return. The church watched closely, of course. Too much wine or dancing, and what started as a solemn event could turn into a full-on party. Still, most clergy understood that even messy joy was better than despair. If villagers wanted to sing about St. Bridget while drinking ale, so be it. Before Lent, the 40 days of fasting, praying, and pretending you didn't just sneak cheese behind the chapel came carnival. For medieval peasants, this was the one time of year when chaos was not just allowed but encouraged. That carnival, or Shrovetide, was a season of organized mischief, like a medieval spring break, but with turnips and fewer regrets. It began just before Ash Wednesday and served as a release valve. If you were about to live like a monk, you first needed to party like you weren't. Masks came out often strange or animal-likes, so people could take on new identities. Devils, kings, even talking pigs. Villagers, dressed in disguise, made rude songs about the nobles and held mock parades where the town fool was crowned king of fools. For a moment, social lines blurred. The food was over the top. You had to eat all the meat, fat, and dairy you couldn't have during Lent. Pancakes, sausages, buttered dishes, you could get them. It was one last taste of indulgence before Lent reminded you of your humble place. Games included throwing flour bags, staging fake battles, and trying to ride livestock. A favorite was the peasant joust, two drunken villagers charging each other with cabbages on sticks. The prize, bruises, and local fame. The church frowned at the wild parts, the jokes, the cross-dressing, the chicken theft, but rarely banned. Carnival wasn't just fun, it was necessary. It allowed peasants to flip their world, laugh at authority, and feel for once in control. Then came Ash Wednesday. The masks were burned, songs ended, the world quieted. Meat vanished, bells rang solemnly. The same villagers who danced by fire half-naked days earlier now sat quietly in church, fasting. But the memory of carnival stayed, a reminder that joy, like ale, was best enjoyed while it lasted. What happens when you combine religion, theater, and a group of partly literate farmers with dramatic flair? You get mystery plays, the major entertainment of medieval life. Long before Netflix or Shakespeare, villagers gathered to watch their neighbors perform the Bible in costumes, sometimes on wagons. Despite the name, mystery plays weren't mysteries like today. The term came from ministerium, Latin for craft or guild, since local guilds often produced them. The Baker's Guild might stage the Last Supper, while the butchers took on the crucifixions, sometimes using real pig's blood for effect. Performed during religious festivals, these plays turned village squares into theaters. Locals came in muddy boots to see biblical stories acted out by friends in makeshift costumes, held together with string and effort. Some productions moved through town on wagons, each one showing a different scene, like a traveling divine drama. The performances weren't always, let's say, theologically precise. Noah's wife might be shown as a nagging woman who won't get on the ark until she finishes her beer. Devils in red tights chased sinners through the crowd while people laughed. When Herod gave a dramatic speech, it often ended with someone throwing vegetables at him. The line between religious teaching and comedy was flexible. But these plays weren't just for fun. They were educational. Most peasants couldn't read, and Latin sermons might as well have been bird sounds. Mystery plays made Bible stories real, emotional, visual, and easy to remember. A man in a crown of thorns, screaming in pain, left a stronger impression than a dusty scroll ever could. The plays also brought people together. They needed costumes, props, rehearsals, and planning. Whole villages worked as a team to make them happen. Even if the angel forgot his lines or St. Peter's beard caught fire from a stage torch, it was a holy mess, but it was their mess. In medieval peasant life, a wedding wasn't just a private event. It was the village's chance to throw the biggest legal party possible. Technically, it was a sacrament. Spiritually, a public agreement. Practically, a festival with lots of ale and confused guests leaving with someone else's cloak. For peasants, marriage was more about duty than romance. Families arranged matches for land, labor, or animals. The bride's dowry might include a pig, a bag of barley, or a decent-looking goat. Love was optional. Strong sons to help in the fields. Necessary. Weddings started with a simple church ceremony, usually held at the church door. Witnesses were important, as were blessings, but don't expect choirs or organs. If you were lucky, someone played a string instrument, or old Joffrey whistled through his missing teeth. After the vows came the real party, the wedding feast. Everyone was invited: family, neighbors, even the thatcher who never finished his work on time. Since hospitality was a big deal, guests brought what they could: bread, eggs, maybe a cooked bird if they were feeling generous. The bride's family provided most of the food, which sometimes meant boiling a single chicken with turnips and calling it stew. Then came the dancing hours of it. Sometimes days. Peasant dances weren't gentle or graceful. They were loud, fast, and messy, with people getting dizzy and someone often falling into the fire. Musicians played whatever instruments hadn't been broken. There were games, two jokes about in-laws, silly songs, and contests like who could drink fastest, or guess how many kids the couple would have before the next harvest. All done with the energy of people who hadn't had this much fun since May Day. At some point, the couple would be walked to their bed by the whole village. This bedding ceremony involved blessings, jokes, and just enough awkward singing to make everyone uncomfortable. The curtains closed, and 9 months later, another celebration. Despite all the festivals and holy days on the medieval calendar, peasants quickly learned a harsh lesson. A holiday didn't always mean a break. Often, it just meant different work with a bit more singing and slightly better food. Sure, the fields rested and the oxen got a break, but roofs still leaked. The priest's barn needed cleaning, and someone had to cook the communal stew usually made of onions and hope. Holidays weren't for resting. They were about helping out with more candles. Let's say it's St. Swithin's Day. No farming today, great, but now you're building an archway from dead branches. Then you're in the mystery play as a Roman soldier named Napatu, who just yells blasphemer and falls into the mud. Later, you're stirring a giant pot while Father Bartholomew complains about your seasoning. Even the 12 days of Yule weren't totally restful. Someone had to gather wood, brew ale, cook a sketchy-looking boar, and keep the Yule log burning, which basically meant working in shifts. If the fire went out early, it was considered bad luck, maybe even a sign of plague. No pressure, kids. And elders weren't off the hook either. Children were sent to collect herbs or deliver oddly shaped bread to neighbors. Elders were expected to sit by the fire and tell stories, ideally ones without fire, plague, or runaway goats. Though, to be honest, those were the best stories. Some villages had things like church cleaning day, cleverly scheduled on a saint's feast so it didn't feel like a chore. And if the local lord wanted a new banner made or the moat cleaned before his feast, guess who got chosen? Still, there were some good parts. Working on a holy day usually meant extra food, maybe a drink of ale, and the shared grumbling of your neighbors. Nothing built teamwork like pulling a rotten log out of the village pond together. Life for peasants was hard, but not without joy. The calendar was filled with festivals, holy days, saints' feasts, and weddings enough to exhaust a modern event planner. These events weren't just breaks from work. They gave life structure, meaning, and rhythm. Each season brought its own mix of sacred and social events. Winter had Yule, candlelit masses, and storytelling by the fire. Spring brought May Day with flowers, bonfires, and secret romances behind hedges. Summer meant saints' parades, pilgrim fairs, and maybe a feast from the Lord that didn't taste like boiled turnips. Autumn wrapped things up with harvest festivals. These weren't flashy but felt deeply rewarding. After months in the fields, peasants came together for shared meals, giving thanks that the saints spared them from famine or locusts. There was dancing, ale, and roasted. Things that maybe shouldn't have been roasted. But no one complained. Even fasting seasons like Lent and Advent played their part. They made the feasts sweeter and the celebrations more meaningful. While the church hoped peasants would spend these times quietly reflecting, most just switched to complaining and eating watery soup until the next excuse to party came. The joy wasn't only in the celebration, it was in the preparation. Planning a mystery play, brewing ale, sewing ribbons into old clothes. These were acts of hope. They gave people something to look forward to. They helped peasants feel alive, connected, and part of something bigger. And maybe that was the true miracle of the medieval festival calendar. It held together a world full of danger and struggle with moments of laughter, music, and shared relief. Whether dancing around a maypole, falling off a wagon, or burning their fingers on the Yule log, peasants found ways to celebrate both the sacred and silly. In the end, they didn't need luxury, just time, community, and a reason to raise a mug and say, "Blessed Saint whoever, we survived another year." Saladanor, as he was known in his time, Yusuf ibn Ayyubaz, born in 1137 in the town of Tikrit, in what is now Iraq. It was a modest beginning in a chaotic region. His Kurdish family wasn't royal, but they weren't poor either. His father, Ijab, was a military officer working for the powerful Zengid dynasty, which ruled much of Syria and northern Iraq. Still, no one looked at young Yusuf and thought, "There goes the future liberator of Jerusalem." Unlike most military leaders of the time, Saladin wasn't raised in a battlefield camp. He grew up in Baalbek and later Damascus, where he studied theology, math, law, and poetry. He read the Quran seriously and developed a deep love for learning. Wasn't a loud, sword-waving teenager. He was quiet, thoughtful, and even scholarly. His early teachers described him as kind and very religious. Not exactly the image of a great warrior at least not yet. But the world around him was far from peaceful. The Crusaders still controlled Jerusalem, and the Muslim world was split by rivalries. Different rulers controlled different areas, each more focused on power than unity. Sunni and Shia factions competed for power, and alliances shifted as quickly as desert winds. In the middle of this chaos, Saladin entered not as a self-proclaimed hero, but as a loyal assistant under his uncle Shirkuh, a tough general serving Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Aleppo. At the time, no one expected Saladin to become important. He was intelligent, obedient, and religious, but not especially charismatic or experienced in battle. He wasn't prepared for leadership. In fact, when he was first sent to Egypt with Shirkuh, some sources say he went unwillingly. His interests were more spiritual than political. He found politics dull, but fate had other ideas. Once Egypt opened its doors, so did opportunity. What made Saladin different wasn't a hunger for power, it was how humbly he handled it. He entered history as a background figure, a nephew, an assistant, a quiet man in a loud and chaotic world. Yet somehow, that quiet man would go on to change history. Saladin didn't arrive in Egypt seeking power. He wasn't even interested in leading. During the 1160s, Egypt was ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate Shia regime, struggling with internal conflict, hunger, and constant political games. When Crusaders and Muslim factions began interfering, Nur ad-Din sent his trusted general, Shirkuh, to bring back order. Saladin, ever the loyal nephew, joined him. He was expected to help Shirkuh, not take over the country. And yet, that's exactly what happened. After several years of difficult campaigns, secret deals, and some questionable deaths, Shirkuh gained control of Cairo, then died suddenly. The question quickly followed: who leads now? The answer was Saladin, though not by choice. The court chose him thinking he would be easy to control, a quiet, religious man with little charm and no real political goals. Seemed ideal, but within months, Saladin proved he was far more than a figurehead. He acted quickly. First, he secured power in Cairo, defeating rivals using diplomacy, religious devotion, and practical skill. Then, in a calculated move, he quietly dismantled the Fatimid Caliphate from the inside. He restored loyalty to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, ending 2 centuries of Fatimid control. This shift was a major religious and political change, and Saladin made it happen without mass violence or palace coups. But his mercy wasn't weakness. He removed corrupt officials, improved roads and services, and reorganized Egypt's messy finances. He brought scholars and judges into his circle. He even made food more affordable for poor people. To a divided nation, he brought order. To outsiders, he made a clear statement. Egypt now had strong leadership. Still, Saladin didn't call himself king. For now, he remained Nur ad-Din's loyal servant. But tension was growing. The student was rising, and the teacher was watching. Egypt was no longer just a distant province in decline. It was becoming the center of Saladin's growing power. And while he didn't ask for the throne, now that he had it, he led with purpose. The reluctant leader had become a sultan, though not in title recognized across the region. Next challenge wasn't the Crusaders, it was his own side. After stabilizing Egypt, he faced a divided Muslim world. The Seljuk Empire had broken into pieces. Syria was still under Nur ad-Din, who had become wary of Saladin's rising influence. Elsewhere, local rulers argued over small territories, while Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands. In theory, they all followed the same faith. In practice, they couldn't even organize a shared meal, let alone a unified holy war. Then, in 1174, Nur ad-Din died suddenly. Another power gap opened and Saladin stepped in. At first, he said he was protecting Nur ad-Din's legacy. He even married into the family. But in reality, Saladin was done playing Secondingaman. He moved north, took Damascus with little resistance, and slowly began uniting the Islamic world not just through war, but through marriage, alliances, negotiations, and when needed, force. Cities that had ignored one another for years suddenly found themselves answering to the man from Aleppo resisted, as did Mosul, but gradually, they fell in line. Unlike many rulers of his time, Saladin was not known for betrayal or cruelty. He pardoned his enemies, kept his promises, and made it difficult for even his opponents to dislike him. This was Saladin's quiet revolution. He wasn't building an empire for wealth or fame. He believed in unity. He understood Muslims couldn't fight crusaders while divided among themselves. And he knew time was running out. The crusaders were strong. Jerusalem was heavily defended. If the Muslim world was going to unite, it had to be now. By the late 1170s, Saladin ruled Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, and even Mecca and Medina. He was no longer just a governor. He was the sultan of a united Islamic world, built through planning, patience, and remarkable restraint. But his biggest challenge still lay ahead, and it flew the cross of the Crusaders. While Saladin had united cities and regions, he had not yet achieved the one goal shared by many Muslims, retaking Jerusalem. By the 1180s, Saladin focused entirely on the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. The Holy City had been under Crusader control for nearly 90 years, a deep wound for the Muslim world. But taking it back required more than desire. Saladin needed timing, planning, and a reason strong enough to unite his allies behind him. That reason came from the Crusaders themselves. One of the most reckless leaders among them was Reynold of Catalana, man so unstable he made other Crusader lords seem cautious. Reynold repeatedly broke peace agreements, attacked Muslim caravans, and even threatened the holy cities of Islam. For Saladin, this wasn't just rude, it was a religious insult. When Reynold attacked a caravan in 1187, during a time of peace, had his justification. No more agreements. No more patience. War was coming. The Crusaders, realizing the danger, gathered their full army. King Guy of Lusignan led the forces, along with Reynold and the Knights Templar. It was a powerful army, confident and experienced. But they made a serious mistake. They marched across the dry plains of Galilee in July, aiming for the water springs near Tiberias, hoping to surprise Saladin. But Saladin let them come. He knew the land, he knew the heat, and he controlled the water sources. His forces kept attacking, cutting the Crusaders off from wells. By the time the Crusaders reached the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin, they were worn out, dehydrated, and surrounded. On July 4, 1187, Saladin attacked. The Battle of Hattin wasn't just a victory, it was a strategic triumph. The Crusader army was destroyed. Thousands were killed or captured. Their most sacred relic, the true cross, was taken. King Guy was captured, and Saladin personally executed Reynold not out of revenge, but for breaking sacred agreements. With this one battle, Saladin broke the Crusaders' military power. Nothing stood between him and Jerusalem. But how would he take the city? Most conquerors use violence and destruction. Saladin had a different plan. After the overwhelming success at Hattin, Saladin moved quickly across the Levant. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, and Ashkelon all surrendered with little resistance. The Crusaders were defeated, leaderless, and shocked. And on October 2nd, 1187, just 3 months after Hattin, Saladin appeared before the gates of Jerusalem. The city's defense was led by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader nobles still standing. Outnumbered and with few options, Balian negotiated with Saladin not to win, but to seek mercy. He warned that if the city were taken by force, the defenders would destroy the holy sites, kill Muslim prisoners, and burn everything. It was a desperate bluff. Saladin didn't take the bait. He chose peace. This is where Saladin's true legacy took shape, not in conquest, but in restraint. Unlike the bloody capture of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, when Christian soldiers killed tens of thousands, Saladin's entry was controlled and respectful. There was no mass killing, no destruction of churches, no widespread violence. He gave Christians the chance to ransom themselves, their families, and their neighbors. Many were released without payment, especially the poor. Saladin even paid the ransom for hundreds who couldn't afford it. He allowed Christian clergy to remain and continue services. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was untouched. Holy places were protected not only for political reasons, but also out of religious conviction. For Saladin, this was not weakness, it was justice. He believed Jerusalem, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, should not be filled with revenge. Showing power without cruelty was, for him, a true sign of faith. His mercy surprised Europe. Even writers hostile to Islam described Saladin with respect. Some even praised him more than their own leaders. By reclaiming Jerusalem, Saladin reversed decades of crusader control and did so with dignity. The city was his, but the world watching from afar saw that his strength came not just from war, but from the choice not to wage it. Europe would not accept this loss quietly. A new wave of crusading energy began. The fall of Jerusalem shocked the Christian world. Popes called for revenge. Kings prepared for battle. Leading this new campaign was Richard the Lionheart, King of England, a skilled fighter, and one of the few names as well known as Saladin's. This marked the start of the Third Crusade, not just a military campaign, but a high-stakes rivalry between two famous leaders. Saladin, the experienced sultan known for mercy. Richard, a bold and clever commander with a reputation for bravery and bloodshed. The world watched as they faced off in the Levant. Richard arrived in the Holy Land in 1191 and quickly captured Acre. It was a harsh siege. When talks with Saladin failed, Richard executed 2,700 Muslim prisoners in one day. Saladin, who had spared many Christians in Jerusalem, was angry. But he didn't respond with the same cruelty. Instead, he focused on discipline and strategy. The two never met in person, but their conflict was personal. They fought at Arsuf, where Richard won a battle, but failed to destroy Saladin's army. Each clash was a display of military skill. Richard was aggressive and creative, using ambushes and flanking. Saladin was patient, cutting off supplies, saving his forces, and avoiding needless losses. But this was more than a military struggle. It was a battle of values. Richard was courageous, but often harsh. Saladin remained honorable, even sending doctors to care for Richard when he fell ill. Though Richard won several battles, he never reached Jerusalem. Poor logistics, bad weather, and strong defenses stopped him. Eventually, both sides understood the war had no clear end. In 1192, they agreed to peace. The Treaty of Jaffa let Christian pilgrims visit Jerusalem, but the city stayed under Muslim control. It wasn't a total win, but a fair compromise. Both leaders, tired from war, honored the agreement. In the end, Saladin kept control of Jerusalem without destroying it. Richard returned to Europe a hero, but Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Two great leaders had faced off, but only one kept the city. Saladin became famous for his battlefield success, but it was his character that made him legendary. Unlike many rulers of his time, Christian or Muslim, he didn't rely on fear or surround himself with flatterers. He was deeply religious, modest, and remarkably humble. For someone who ruled a vast empire from Egypt to Mesopotamia, he slept on simple mats, gave away personal wealth, and cried during religious sermons. He avoided luxury, no gold-covered palaces or grand displays. For him, power was a responsibility, not a reward. He fasted often, not just during Ramadan, and studied the Quran as carefully as he planned battles. He prayed before battles, but more importantly, prayed afterward, not to celebrate victory, but to mourn the dead. When advisors pushed for harsh punishment, he often refused. Victory is not in killing, he once said, but in forgiving. These were not just words. After taking Jerusalem, he could have destroyed churches, killed prisoners, and celebrated with a show of force. Instead, he protected holy places, freed captives, and made sure Christian pilgrims could travel safely, even if they had no money. He also supported Jewish communities and treated Eastern Christian groups with respect. His kindness wasn't limited to To religion, he gave away money, paid dowries for orphaned girls, and built schools, hospitals, and public fountains. His court focused on learning, not wealth. It was filled with scholars, legal experts, and poets, not warriors in shiny armor. But Saladin wasn't naive. He understood politics, timing, and power better than many kings. He knew when to show force and when to hold back. He used fear sparingly and only when necessary. When he executed Reynold of Chatillon, it was a calculated act of justice, not revenge. Saladin didn't just command armies. He led by example. His devotion wasn't for show. His mercy wasn't weakness. His self-control wasn't fear. He became one of the few figures in medieval history, respected by both friends and foes even centuries later. But even legends come to an end, and Saladin's final chapter was quiet. In 1193, only months after making peace with Richard, Saladin became ill. He was just 55, young by today's standards, but the constant battles, political work, and spiritual life had worn him down. The man who had once led armies and crossed deserts now lay sick in bed, weak from fever. He didn't call in generals or save riches. Instead, he focused on prayer, read the Quran, and gave away what little wealth he had left. This isn't poetic exaggeration. When Saladin died, his treasury was almost empty. There wasn't enough money to pay for his funeral. The man who had ruled a vast empire left behind 1 dinar, 47 dirhams, and a legacy far greater than any crown. His death was simple, no assassination, no betrayal, just a quiet ending that matched the way he had lived. He was buried in Damascus, near the main mosque, in a plain tomb. No palace, no gold. His coffin was wrapped in a simple cloth. Years later, German Emperor Wilhelm II visited the grave and donated a new marble casket. Even European royalty, long after the Crusades, came to honor him. Saladin's empire didn't last long after his death. Like many strong rulers, he had held a fragile alliance together. Once he was gone, his family fought over power. Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia eventually split again. But Saladin's memory endured. In the Muslim world, he remained the model of just leadership, a warrior who fought for fairness, not greed. In the Christian world, he was the rare enemy, remembered with respect. European writers called him noble, wise, and even holy, words rarely used for those they had once called infidels. It's said Saladin kept a burial shroud near his bed to remind himself that in the end, nothing, no kingdom, no fame, not even Jerusalem would follow him to the grave. And yet, his name still does. Saladin died in 1193, but his story never did. His reputation grew not just in the Muslim world, but across cultures and generations. While many medieval rulers were forgotten or criticized, Saladin was remembered as something greater, a man of both war and peace, of faith and fairness, of power and humility. In the Muslim world, his name became a symbol of righteous rule. For centuries, leaders spoke of him to strengthen their own image, though few could truly match his character. His idea of jihad was not based on fanaticism, but on responsibility. He fought to protect lands and people, not to gain fame. He ruled fairly, consulted scholars, and died with nothing in his name. In many ways, he became the example, the ideal Muslim leader that many tried to imitate. But what's more surprising is that Saladin was also respected by the Christian world. Even though he was the main enemy during the Crusades, European writers and historians described him positively. Dante placed him among the virtuous non-Christians in the Divine Commedia, major honor in Christian belief. Boccaccio wrote about his generosity, and over time, Saladin became a noble figure in European stories. By the 1800s, Western leaders referred to him as a model of honorable behavior even during colonial conflicts in the Middle East. His reputation became greater than the empire he led. In the modern era, Saladin's image remains powerful. Arab nationalists in the 20th century saw him as a symbol of unity and resistance. Statues of him still stand in Damascus and Cairo. Streets, schools, and even military vehicles carry his name. He is remembered not just as a military leader, but as someone who earned respect from both his followers and his enemies. And maybe that is Saladin's greatest achievement. Not just retaking Jerusalem, defeating Crusader kings, or leading an empire, but proving that even in a violent time, it was possible to lead with kindness, fight with integrity, and leave behind a legacy of respect and fear. He died a sultan, but he was remembered as something much more. The Yoshiwara district in Edo was not just a place. It was a whole world, hidden behind wooden gates and filled with fantasy. Officially approved by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1617, it was created to keep pleasure contained and out of public view. But it became something more complex, a vivid world of painted faces, silk clothing, and quiet love stories shared behind paper walls. At the center were the courtesans. They weren't just sex workers, they were cultural stars. The highest ranking, the oyan, were icons of beauty and culture. They trained for years in poetry, music, calligraphy, and the art of subtle conversation. They wore layers of decorated kimono, their hair styled with elaborate pins, and every move was carefully practiced. A glance from an oyan could cost a fortune. A conversation was worth even more. From the outside, it looked luxurious. But inside, Yoshiwara was a cage made of gold. Many women entered as children, sold by struggling families, and their contracts could last decades. Their names were changed, their clothes chosen, and their image shaped for business. The outside world became distant. The sad truth was that these women were admired for their grace and charm, but they were not free, not chained, but trapped by silken duty. For clients, Yoshiwara offered not just pleasure, but illusion. Samurai could leave behind their armor, merchants could act like poets, and everyone could forget their social status for one night. But the dream ended by morning. Names were forgotten. Any love that formed was left behind like old memories. Real affection was risky in a courtesan who fell in love could be punished or sold to another brothel. A samurai who fell for someone beneath his rank could lose everything. Still, it happened often. Whispers of forbidden romance floated through the narrow streets like smoke. There, always unsafe. This was Yoshiwara's paradox, a place that sold love, but where real love could only cause pain. To outsiders, geisha and courtesans were often confused, but within Yoshiwara, the difference was clear even. If candlelight and perfume sometimes blurred the lines, courtesans, especially the high-ranking, were the stars. Legally sex workers, they were respected like celebrities. Clients paid not just for sex, but for the performance of Desire Living poem in silk. They were out of reach unless someone had the time and wealth of a lord. Geisha were different. They were performers, not lovers. They played the shamisen, wrote clever haiku, and served sake with practiced grace. Their talent was their appeal. Confusing a geisha with a courtesan was disrespectful both to her and to the strict rules of Yoshiwara. A geisha might flirt or tease, but if a client expected more, he'd be laughed out of the tea house. Still, both roles shared one truth. Choice was mostly an illusion. Most women didn't come to Yoshiwara by choice. They were sold, orphaned, or simply too poor to live outside its walls. Even those who became famous were bound by debt, contracts, and reputation. Leaving the profession at its height was nearly impossible without a rich patron to buy her freedom. This practice, Muki, was rare and not always romantic. It could mean freedom more, just a new kind of control. Yet some women found small ways to express themselves. A clever joke in the tea house, a rebellious glance during a performance, or a hidden poem tucked into a client's sleeve, inside Yoshiwara's strict system. Quiet defiance became its own kind of art. People saw polished smiles and perfect dances but missed the cost of keeping that illusion. Night after night, under dim lanterns, women performed not just for money, but for survival. In Yoshiwara, power was temporary, ever truly yours. Technically, samurai had no place falling in love in Yoshiwara. They were expected to be men of honor, duty, and self-control, loyal to their lords, faithful to the shogunate, and symbols of discipline. But Yoshiwara was designed to make men forget who they were. For certain samurai, it wasn't just a distraction, it was a trap. One lined with silk, sweet smells, and smiles that saw too much. Romances between courtesans and samurai were forbidden, not because they were rare, but because they were too common and too dangerous. For a courtesan, love could ruin her image. She couldn't afford to favor anyone. She was a product of dream. Love could break that illusion and upset the balance in the brothel. *** for a samurai. The risks were higher. Loving a courtesan could damage his honor, cause scandal, or break strict social rules. Samurai were expected to visit, enjoy, and forget. Love wasn't part of the deal. But still, it happened. Some samurai returned again and again, spending too much, writing secret poems, or hiding love notes and folding fans. Sometimes the courtesan replied a small squeeze of the hand. A quiet poem slipped into his sleeve. These weren't affairs. They were quiet acts of defiance against a world that demanded constant performance. The consequences, though, could be severe. There are stories of samurai who sold their swords just to spend time with someone they loved. Some lost their rank, their money, even their lives. A few were discovered and ordered to commit seppuku ritual suicide to make up for their disgrace. For the women, punishments ranged from public shame to being transferred to harsher brothels. But the most painful stories didn't end in scandal, ended in sadness. Lovers who realized there was no way out, no future, only the faint scent of incense and a promise made too late. That's when the most tragic ending happened. The double suicide pact. Shinjar, two lovers, kept apart by society, choosing death rather than another day alone, and Yoshiwara. Some romances bloomed like cherry blossoms, beautiful and bound to fall. In a district where every look was rehearsed and every touch had a price, love could only exist in a space between words. In Yoshiwara, words not, whispers carried the feelings people couldn't speak. Poetry wasn't just entertainment in the pleasure quarters. It was a hidden language. Haiku, tanka, and short prose poems floated through the air like petals, passed between geisha, courtesans, and clients to express feelings too risky to say out loud. A poem tucked into a sleeve or a fan could carry the weight of a heart without ever naming love. For courtesans and others, poetry was part of their training. They learned to write on the spot, turning sadness into grace and flirtation into metaphor. A courtesan might gently reject a client's poem with a verse about a distant moon or an uncrossable river. But if she returned his feelings, her words became a lifeline, a secret promise. Samurai, merchants, and even imperial poets came to Yoshiwara, not only for pleasure, but for a chance to match verses with women whose words were as sharp as their eyes. Love letters weren't crude. They were carefully crafted, often scented with plum perfume, and hidden in sleeves or sandals. But each poem was also a risk. If a madam found a love letter, there could be punishment. A client seen too often at the same house might be watched. If a samurai's lord discovered the affair, it could ruin his career, or worse. Still, the poems continued. Some became famous, saved in notebooks, printed in collections, even copied by later lovers trying to feel the same desperate beauty. Others were burned before morning, their ashes scattered like secrets too dangerous to keep. In a world where love was bought and sold, poetry let it become something else, fragile, brief, and forbidden. Something you could hold in your hand, read under candlelight, and for a moment, believe was real. For most women in Yoshiwara, freedom wasn't a dream, it was a number, a cost. Courtesans, especially the elite, were trapped by contracts. They owed money for their training, clothing, housing, and food. Every kimono, every hairstyle, every performance added to a debt that grew faster than it could be paid. The only way out was miswage being bought out. A wealthy patron, usually a merchant or retired samurai, could pay off the full debt and free the courtesan. It sounds romantic, and sometimes it was, but often it was just another deal, one gilded cage replaced by another. Some women were truly rescued. They married into comfort, or started quiet lives away from the red lanterns of Edo. Others just moved into new roles: concubine, mistress, unofficial wife, kept out of sight and treated as property. Even in freedom, they were rarely seen as equals. Some tried to escape without payment. These stories often ended badly. Yoshiwara was guarded. Security was strict. Women caught running away were punished, paraded through the streets, their hair cut in shame, or sent to lower-ranking brothels with harsher conditions. But sometimes, rarely, a courtesan escaped, dressed as a servant, hidden in a palace, helped by a lover, willing to risk everything. These women became legends. Their stories were whispered in tea-houses and acted out in kabuki plays, always ending the same way: freedom, but at a price. Still, the idea of escape never faded. It lived in the stories they told each other, in the songs they sang at night, in the poems hidden beneath floor mats. Even the most obedient courtesan carried two lives: the one she showed and the one she dreamed about when the lights went out. A life beyond the walls, a real name, a love without price. That escape was rare. True freedom, even rarer. But in a world built on illusion, hope was the one thing no one could take. Yoshiwara sold pleasure, but its most lasting stories were tragic. None more so than Shinja, the lover's suicide. These weren't just myths or stage dramas. Even though kabuki often turned them into both, they were real, painful events caused by despair. When a courtesan and her lover saw no way forward, when debt crushed them, society blocked them, and love became unbearable, they sometimes chose death. Most pacts followed a pattern. The courtesan, trapped by a contract she couldn't escape, and her lover, often a samurai or merchant held back by duty or family. They'd meet secretly, share poems and tea, then disappear. Some used knives. Others tied themselves together and drowned. Their bodies were often found still holding each other. Even in death, they stayed close. The public reaction was mixed shock and fascination. Officials called Shinja immoral. Brothels increased security. The government banned such stories on stage, but the public was captivated. These tragic deaths became romanticized in songs and plays like the love suicides, and amid audiences cried. Poets wrote elegies, but beneath the drama was a painful truth. These were people so trapped, so starved for dignity, that death seemed gentler than life. Not all courtesans died for love. Most lived on, aged out of Yoshiwara, quietly. But those who chose or were pushed into death became part of Japan's cultural memory, remembered in blood and blossoms. ****, in a place where everything was a performance. Shinja was the one act that couldn't be faked. In the candlelit world of Yoshiwara, art was more than beauty, it was resistance. Every gesture, every painted fan, every folded kimono was a silent protest against a life without freedom. Courtesans and geisha were trained artists. They studied traditional music, dance, painting, poetry, and manners. Their role was to show the ideal woman, graceful, wise, and composed. But these performances were also acts of control. In a world that took almost everything from them, beauty became armor. A perfect wig, a 17-syllable poem, a graceful dance. These weren't just for clients. They were ways to hold on to identity, to say, I'm still here. I decide how I'm seen. Their art didn't stay inside the brothels. It reached the outside world through woodblock prints, UKIYO-E, or pictures of the floating world. Artists like Kitagawa, Utamaro, and Suzuki Harunobu captured glimpses of their lives. A woman fixing her hair, a geisha gazing outside, lovers under falling blossoms. These images became widely popular, collected by both commoners and nobles. They turned courtesans into icons while also exposing the loneliness behind the beauty. Some courtesans even became muses. Their faces appeared in paintings, plays, and erotic novels. Their poems were printed in small chapbooks, traded like treasures among the literate. For a few, this artistic fame gave them something rare, a voice. Still, the art never fully captured the truth. Behind each print was a woman in debt. Behind each poem, a contract. behind every graceful smile. Someone counting the days until she was free or too old to be wanted. But the art gave them something they weren't meant to have: agency. It allowed them to shape part of their story, even if only in pieces. In a world built to control their story, even a small piece was a form of power. In Yoshiwara, beauty wasn't just currency. It was a ticking clock. Every painted face, every silken sleeve, hid an expiration date. And while the world outside the pleasure district saw courtesans as symbols of elegance and sensuality, inside, everyone knew youth was the business. It wouldn't last. A courtesan's value began to drop the moment she reached her peak. Her bookings slowed. Her clients aged. New girls arrived, fresher, more stylish, more in demand. Like a lantern at dawn, her time in the spotlight faded until it quietly disappeared. Most women had no grand farewell, no ceremony, no goodbye. Some quietly retired after clearing their debts and opened small tea shops or worked as hairdressers. Others stayed behind the scenes, straining new girls, dressing hair, or managing guests. But many were simply cast out of the district once they could no longer sell the illusion. Some were fortunate enough to be bought out before aging caught up. A wealthy client might take them to a private home or offer marriage, though this often meant another kind of dependence. For those who aged out without a sponsor, survival meant finding new roles. And in a society that judged women by their looks, that often meant humiliation. In rare cases, former courtesans reinvented themselves as Okami-respected owners of tea houses or using their skills, contacts, and experience to stay afloat. But these were the exceptions. Most left Yoshiwara with only the clothes on their back and memories of a life that was both dreamlike and exhausting. No one made woodblock prints of them once their faces lost their glow. No poets wrote odes to aging hands or tired eyes. The same world that once praised them erased them the moment they stopped shining. Yet in those quiet exits, there was a kind of honesty. The illusion was gone. The silk robes were folded away. The smile was no longer needed because, in Yoshiwara, the real tragedy wasn't just lost love or faded youth. It was the silence that came after. When the music stopped, the candles burned out, and the woman behind the mask finally went home unnamed and unseen. Today, Yoshiwara's lanterns no longer glow. The narrow streets that once echoed with music, laughter, and whispered poems are now filled with apartments and convenience stores. But the stories remain, like smoke. Yoshiwara officially closed in 1958 when legal prostitution ended in Japan. By then, it had already become a faded shadow of its past. World War II bombings destroyed much of its architecture. The elegant pleasure houses, fan shops, and tea rooms disappeared, and with them, the lives of thousands of women faded from public memory. Still, Yoshiwara never fully died. Its spirit lives on in kabuki plays, ukiyo-e prints, novels, and old poems still taught in schools. Today, Oyen parades are reenacted at festivals, with women in tall wigs and 12 layered kimonos, honoring those who came before them. And though few names are remembered, the courtesans of Yoshiwara remain part of Japan's cultural memory, not just as entertainers, but as survivors, poets, and quiet trailblazers. Modern Japan still wrestles with their legacy. On one hand, these women are romanticized, turned into symbols of beauty and mystery. On the other, their pain is often ignored. Their lives are still misunderstood, blurred by fantasy and shame. They weren't just women in elaborate makeup. They were girls sold into bondage, artists who turned performance into strength, lovers who risked everything for moments of genuine feeling. Maybe that's why their ghosts are said to linger. Locals still tell stories of Yoshiwara's spiritswomen seen wandering alleys at night, their kimonos trailing behind them, searching for what was lost. Some say the old brothel sites carry a strange stillness, as if the past refuses to vanish completely. Whether or not the spirits are real, one thing is clear: Yoshiwara is part of Japan's soul. It is the memory of a hidden world, built on illusion marked by pain, yet full of beauty and fleeting joy.